Liisa Hilja Tjader was born in Ternava, Finland in 1887, the daughter of Matti Anderspoken Tjader and Liisa Jonataitar Nikarppinen. When she was 16 years old, her sister Anna Matilda, who was married to Sakar Sapla, sent her passage money to America. She arrived on the SS Freeland in Philadelphia on April 7, 1903. Jonas Raiha was born in Rautio, Finland in 1871. He came over to America on the Urania and landed in New York on May 5, 1903. Both came from towns close to Oulu, Finland. When Jonas arrived, he left behind his wife Maria and their 3 children, Aili 7, John 5, and Sama 3. 3 years after arriving, Maria had fallen down a flight of stairs and died shortly thereafter, leaving the care of the children with their grandparents. A few years after being in America, Liza had her first son Rudy in July of 1907. Rudy was the son of a fiddle player that she knew the year before, but who had moved back down to the New York Mills area where his family had a farm. She then met Jonas Raiha, who was 16 years older than her. They were married on October 21, 1907 by Pastor Nimi, who was a traveling pastor in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. In the spring of 1908, Jonas's dead wife Maria's sister was coming over to Brule, Wisconsin to meet up with her husband, and so brought along his children from Finland, who at that time Aili was 12, John was 10, and Sima was 8. Jonas worked as a carpenter and also in the lumbering camps. Jonas told Liza that more homestead lands are being offered in the cutover land south of town, some even within the Indian reservation of Fond du Lac. With the timber gone from the land, the government was offering it to the immigrants. People were moving out of town every day. Jonas and Liza then acquired some land not too far from the Sawyer store. In 1909, Arnold was born. He came so fast that there was no time for the children to go get Mrs. Isaacson from the Sawyer store to assist with the birth, so Liza had 2-year-old Rudy assist her while the older children went outside. In 1910, Sylvia was born, and then in 1912, Jonas was born. The older children from Finland, Aili, John, and Sima, attended the Normantown Day School for the reservation, which was located south of the tracks on a hill in Sawyer. It was the only school that they could walk to. It was a mild winter. Liza knew that she'd be having another summer baby when she counted up before Christmas and realized there would be an 8th child in 1913. Luckily, Jonas could still do some building work. It was Christmas Eve, 1912. They were all looking forward to the holiday, but the weather turned stormy, so no doubt that the men would finish work early. The children pressed their faces to the window, watching for Papa in the swirling snow. He should have been home. They watched and waited. It was dark when Veino Samolas brought Jonas home on the cart that carried their tools, ropes, and all that they used to pull out the stumps in the cutover land. Wet garments were froze over her husband. There was only one horse. Veino told the terrible story. They were still working near Wild Rice Lake when the wind shifted. All week the weather had been in the 40s. The new wind made it feel like 0. And it began to rain, then sheets of freezing rain. So they headed for home, the storm making it darker than the hour it was. The horse to the left of the lake got skittish, seemed to lose sense of direction because the small roadway was covered with snow. The horse turned sharp right and then walked them all into the icy lake. He was in past his forelegs when he knew something was wrong, but the fool horse went straight ahead until the water reached his chest. Then the animal recoiled and made a large circle left. So the good horse on the right went through to the outer part of the new circle and into deep water and then stopped dead. Jonas went into the water to pull on the lead so that they could all get out, but could not do it. Veino got upset at what was happening, but he too plunged in and cut the horse free and pulled Jonas out of the lake and got him onto the cart. The horse brought them all to the homestead because it was the closest house, even closer than Hanrat's homestead further east on the big roadway. Strong coffee, a warm fire could not seem to rouse Jonas. The doctor came and shook his head. Time, he said, it will take time. Jonas then died a few months later in April of 1913 in St. Luke's Hospital. After he died, men had started to come to the homestead and started to take things that they said that Jonas did not pay for. At least they said Jonas did not pay for them. Her home was being stripped. They came and took the things that she thought were hers now. Tools from the barn and the shed. One cow was taken, some lumber stacked behind the shed, and she argued with them. But it was no use. How could she feed the children without tools to work, without the cow? Will you come and take the children too? She lashed out at them. But did Jonas actually owe anybody any money? As I reviewed the abstract, they had acquired land in January 1910. In February 1910, they had taken out a mortgage for $700, and then in August of that same year, another mortgage for $300. Both mortgages were paid off in May of 1912. However, in June of 1912, they took out another $650 mortgage to the Reliable Investment Company and an additional $230 mortgage in which they paid 8% interest. In April of 1913, Jonas had died. However, in October 1913, Liza was still able to pay off the $230 mortgage. For over a year, Liza worked on the farm trying to provide for her 8 children. On September 10, 1914, on her 14th birthday, Sima was brought to the Owatonna orphanage after the probate court ordered it the day before. She was accompanied by Mrs. Oscar Isaacson. A little over a month later, Liza appeared in court again with Mrs. Isaacson regarding her own 5 children. The probate court petitioned for the 5 children and stated that the father is dead and the mother is unable to care for them. Now ordered to bring her own children to the Owatonna orphanage, Liza and Mrs. Isaacson made the journey with them that same day. They also brought 2 other children from the Havala family, also ordered to the orphanage. Rudy was 7, Arnold 5, Sylvia 4, Jonas 2, and Martha was 16 months. After leaving the children in Owatonna, Liza returned to her farm in Sawyer and for several days lay in a rage so black none dared touch her. Eiley, almost 18 years, and 16-year-old John remained with her. October 19, 1914, a few days after the arrival in Owatonna. The Owatonna Orphanage Superintendent Merrill sent a letter to the judge regarding the request from the mother to hold the children indefinitely to give her an opportunity to take them. He states, "We are willing to hold them for 6 months, or perhaps a little longer if there is a reasonable prospect that the mother will be able to make a suitable home for them, but we cannot hold them indefinitely. Please advise." The children were sent to the orphanage at Owatonna, a small town in southern Minnesota about 300 miles away. Here the children lived in dormitories or huge cottage homes separated into groups by sex and age. Each child did chores in the many buildings or around the huge farm that was part of the complex, so they did see other members of the family and talk to them. The Owatonna Orphanage was created in 1885 by the state legislature. The legislation called for the transfer of children from impoverished natural families to the state school. The school would serve as an interim institution in a cottage-style environment to ensure the children were in good health and educated in some measure before being placed out on an indentured contract. A lot of the children that went through Owatonna had one or both parents living. Such children became wards of the state and relationships with their real families were canceled. Parents did not always realize they were relinquishing all the rights to their children when they signed the state school commitment papers. Such parents returned to try to regain custody of their children and were refused. Although children often entered the school as siblings, cottage assignments by age and gender separated them. They were further separated by indentured to different families. Many children lost track of their families and were never reunited with parents or siblings ever again. All the children that arrived at the Owatonna orphanage were assigned numbers. For many years, the children that died at the orphanage were buried underneath only their number and not their name. When the Raiha children arrived, they also were assigned their numbers. Rudy was 5063, Arnie was 5064, Sylvia 5065, Jonas 5066, and Martha was 5067. One of the chores given older girls was the care of the young children, so Sima often tended to little Sylvia and Martha, but so did the other girls. One of these was Muriel, who formed an attachment to Martha and called her her baby and often edged Sima from caring for her. Being adopted from the home was almost like going to heaven. It was a cause for rejoicing. Sima was working in the kitchen when Muriel came up to her and said, "Guess what? I'm being adopted and I'm taking Martha with me." Sima did not want to believe her, but Muriel gloated so much she knew it was true. Muriel and her two sisters were being adopted by the Rife sisters, Minna and Henrietta of North St. Paul. They were single women in their 30s who had thought to offer their spacious home to teenage girls and also see to their education. Muriel insisted on bringing her baby with her. She would care for Martha. After just 1 month at the orphanage, the Raiha children all watched a horse-drawn carriage take the baby Martha away. The Rifes did not think Martha an appealing child. Her hair was so funny, thin, and so blonde it was white. After putting a cap on the sight, they all boarded a train for St. Paul. Muriel said that Martha pulled the cap off and laughed. Soon everyone was laughing at the struggle to keep the cap on the white-haired child. Later she was given the nickname that of Finny for her Finnish ancestry. A month after the children were left in Owatonna, Eileen married Charles Belteri a few days after her 18th birthday and moved to Virginia, Minnesota with them. March 8, 1915, Liza and Vano Samola applied for a marriage license. 10 days later, the Carleton County probate judge sent a letter to Superintendent Merrill. Dear Sir, Mrs. Raiha, mother of the Raiha children committed to your institution last October, is anxious to see her children and to get her baby. I urge Mrs. Isaacson, the party that accompanied Mrs. Raiha to the school with the children, to persuade Mrs. Raiha to wait a few days, thereby allowing me to get a reply from you. However, Mrs. Raiha can hardly wait for her youngest child, and so I am dropping this letter today, as Mrs. Raiha will be there sometime tomorrow evening, or if she could be persuaded to wait 1 week, then 1 week later. If anything you could do to help her in this matter, kindly do so. She has come her little home ready, 2 cows from which she makes a little ready money, and is backed by credit by Mrs. Isaacson and the Isaacson store. I shall give Mrs. Raiha a letter of introduction from this office. If anything prevents her from obtaining the baby at this time, please let me know at once. March 19th, the reply is sent back to the probate court. The child is not now in the school, and the mother could not see her if she came here. As I wrote you, arrangements had been completed by receiving your letter recommending that the children be kept for their mother to place this child in the home of 2 ladies in St. Paul who were devoting their lives and wealth to rearing homeless children. The child was placed, however, with the understanding that the mother should become able to take the children back, and wanted Martha she'd be available for her. The best way to arrange the matter will be for one of our agents to see the mother and see the ladies who have Martha and arrange for the transfer. The other 4 children are here, and the mother can see them if she comes. After arriving to find Martha gone, Liza applied to take Sylvia from the school and was granted permission to do so. After returning to Sawyer with Sylvia, her financial troubles did not end. In July of 1915, the Reliable Investment Company started the foreclosure process. In August, the sheriff's certificate was issued for the foreclosure on the farm. August 12, 1915, Liza and Vano marry. Later that same year, up north in Virginia, Eileen and Charles Belteria had their first son, Rudolph Belt. In March of 1916, Vienna was born, and then in April, the state agent came to see how Sylvia was doing on the farm. From the state agent's report on 5-year-old Sylvia, the question, is it contented? The answer, yes. Question, is it liked by the guardian? The answer, not very well. The guardian's treatment of the child. Answer, is not satisfactory. The mother, who is now Mrs. Samola, has attended dances and all-night parties, leaving Sylvia alone in the house, and when asked why she did so, she assured it was all right for such a young age. Recommendations and remarks. Since Mr. Raiha died, Mrs. Raiha has been traveling a fast pace, according to neighbors. Vana Samola went to live with her and married her last fall after the town officials threatened to have them arrested. A license was procured last spring, but the marriage did not take place until 2 months before Mrs. Samola gave birth to a child. Mrs. Samola had planned on putting an ad in the Carleton paper for a family to adopt Sylvia, and was prevented from doing so by Mrs. Isaacson, who accompanied the children here. She says that Mrs. Samola is not a fit person to have the care of her children, as she does not appear to have any love for them, and has neglected Sylvia shamefully, refusing her all association with other children and locking her in the house both day and night. It is interesting to note in the state agent's report that Vienna was born 2 months after the marriage, when in reality she was born 7 months after they were married. So on April 14, 1916, 5-year-old Sylvia was returned to the orphanage after the state agent visit. Later that summer, a quitclaim deed was issued by Hilja to Väinö Samola in order to save the farm. Väinö and Liisa did mortgage the farm for $700 in order to keep it. On December 26, 1916, a letter is sent to the probate court from Elizabeth of Virginia. Dear Sir, as you may remember, the youngest children of Jonas Raiha, deceased, were sent to the state public school at Owatonna, Minnesota in September 1914. Now we have learned that Saima, the crippled girl, is not going to school this year, but is being directed to work in the nursery by Superintendent G. A. Merrill. I am sure that you feel just as sad as we are for the sake of the unfair treatment the poor crippled girl is experiencing at the school. If one person in the institution is having the privilege of going to school at her age, why should they deny it to the crippled child whose living depends almost entirely on obtaining an education and a profession of some kind, as she is unable to help herself by common labor because her right side is almost completely crippled? She has only these 2 years at the school, and where do you think this innocent girl will find her place in the world without an education or an able body to labor with? I am enclosing her heartbreaking letter where she states how glad she would be if once more she had the chance to attend school, and from which you can judge the standard of her present education. Knowing you so well, I feel that you'll be glad to take up the matter with Merle, superintendent, and see that Saima, the crippled orphan, will have a chance to attend school from the first of the year. Hoping that you do your utmost to brighten the future of the poor girl, we remain Ili and Sia Belteri. Over. P.S. As to what the officers of the school have insisted in us taking Saima with us, and we being so well off, I will state that it will be too burdensome for us, for I am working in a store owned by a poor class of people, and they cannot afford to pay their employees high wages, and living comes very high here in Virginia, as you cannot rent a flat for hardly any old shack for less than $25 a month. The probate judge then forwarded this letter to Merle at the orphanage on January 31, 1917. Merle responds on February 3, 1917. He disagreed and said that Saima completed all the grades at the state school and due to her limitations did not seem appropriate to send her to the town school. The training in the nursery at the state school under the direct supervision of a competent nurse is in her best interest. March 19, 1917. With references from his employers, Charles Belteri and Ili put in an application to get Saima out of the state school. Their object for taking the child is to give her a proper education. March 26. The application is received and the letter sent that she will leave the next day, accompanied by an agent, as she is very anxious to go live with the family. On the 27th, Saima and the state agent arrive in Virginia, and the state agent reports the following. She will be living in a 4-room flat where the furnishings are very comfortable and the home has books and periodicals. There is one son who is 16 months in the home. She will attend the 8th grade and more if she does well. Mr. Belteri has a good position and they own a lot in West Virginia where they will build a home. They will not send her to school until September. Mrs. Belteri does not speak or understand English very well, but I explained fully to Mr. Belteri that they were responsible for the girl's welfare in every way, and that they must not allow her to be out alone at night or with undesirable company. Saima does not have a room of her own, but has a comfortable Davenport bed in the living room. February 17, 1918. Charles Belteri sends a letter to Merrill at the state school. As we have not heard from there for a long time as to how the Raiha children are, I thought it best to drop you a few lines and inquire. Saima is still with us and is doing well in school in the 8th grade and is doing fair on the average. On my visit there last spring, I deposited $1 with their secretary for the purpose of having pictures taken of the children together and requested her to send a few to us, but we have not heard yet on this matter. Trusting that you will reconsider the matter, I remain yours truly, C.M. Beltari. The response back from Merrill was that there was a picture taken and the copies were sent to their mother. Because they did not receive their own copy, he did send one in the response letter. He also reported that the children are all in homes now, and our reports from them indicate that they are well, happy, and getting along nicely. June 11, 1918, the final state agent report on Sama. The state agent reported that Sama will graduate from the 8th grade on June 14th. She did well in school, but does not know what she will do in the fall. Sama then reached the age of majority and was no longer under the supervision of the state Owatonna orphanage. So what became of the other children when they got to the orphanage? For little Jonas, when he was 3 and a half, he contracted the measles. He was very fortunate because there was no vaccine for the measles until 1963. Over the years that the orphanage was open, 198 children had died, half of them under the age of 3. A lot of children were indentured out to families. Families that had taken children home had to make sure that they went to school, trained them in an occupation, and treated them as one of the family. When they're 18 years old, if they're a boy, they receive $75 for their service, or $50 if they're a girl. They had 3 months to try out a child. Families were encouraged to visit the orphanage to pick out a child, or if they couldn't, one was selected out for them in exchange for $2 of transport. The Quades was sent a letter stating that Jonas was a nice-looking boy with large brown eyes and light hair. He was of Finnish parentage, and his father had died. Jonas was then sent to the Quades in Wells, Minnesota. At that point, he had to walk 2.5 miles to school, but the Quades promised to transport him when the weather was not favorable. They owned 160 acres, were described as a nice young couple in their 30s, and had been married for 4 years. At age 15, it was reported that Jonas was attending a German Lutheran school. He had a temper, wanted his own way, and liked to be out nights and get moonshine. Mrs. Quaid said everything was under control, but that he might not keep obeying them until he was 18. He was currently in the 8th grade and did not want to attend school, but they promised to keep him in school until he turned 18, but not to high school. On October 1st, 1928, when he was 17 and a half, Jonas ran away from the Quades and stayed at a neighbor's house, making $50 a month working for him. A week later, he came back to get his clothes. The orphanage then left it up to the Quades to pay him the $75, but said they were under no obligation to do so since he left early. At 17, Jonas sent a letter to the orphanage asking for money from the Quades and whereabouts of his brothers and sisters. At age 19, he sent another letter, again asking for money from the Quades. The Quades finally did pay him $50, which they prorated in 1931 when he was 19 years old. Rudolph was also indentured out from the orphanage. On his birth certificate, he is listed as John R. Tjader, as he had been born before Liisa met Jonas. He was always referred to as Rudolph, so as not to be confused with Jonas's son from his first marriage, John Arvid. John Rudolph was indentured out from the orphanage in 1917 to Joseph Bolton of Fairfax, Minnesota. In the state agent report in 1918, it noted that Mrs. Bolton is getting old and rather feeble, much older than Mr. Bolton. John is a really nice and good boy and is doing well. They have an auto now, and he is very happy over it. On the state agent's report in 1920, John was 13 years old and in the 6th grade. He reported, "John is good now. He broke his arm last spring while cranking their car." In the report of 1922, the agent reported the following: "I would consider the home a rather poor one. Mrs. Bolton is a typical old Irish peasant woman. She resembles a little dried-up witch. She was evidently much older than her husband, and he is German. He says nothing, and she does all the talking, mostly complaining about how hard and expensive it is to bring up a boy, and becomes wildly excited when told that the boy cannot be kept home for spring work or whenever she needs his help. Mr. Bolton does road work for the highway, and I imagine the old lady and boy do much of the farm work as they can. The Boltons have raised 2 girls, and Mrs. Bolton wanted another girl, but I did not encourage that. She is too old, and the girl would be too near John's age, but I did not go into details as I knew she'd become excited. Even though Mrs. Bolton is so old, she seems to be keen and active, and I think can manage and look after a boy in a satisfactory manner. They could not find his report card, so I asked them to send it to me. The Boltons did follow up and send them the report card later. In the report to 1923, he was age 15. It was reported that its moral condition not so bad as Mrs. Bolton makes out. She says that he is too lazy to live. The guardian's treatment of the child was reported as being entirely too much nagging and fault-finding by the old lady. In the remarks, the agent wrote, Mrs. Bolton is getting old and unreasonable, but John says he can stand it. I talked to Mr. Bolton that works on the highway as a patrolman, and he says John is all right. In the state's agent report in 1924, he reported that John graduated from the 8th grade and wants to go to high school. Mrs. Bolton is asking for a girl again, and the agent will check after she returns. On April 8, 1925, Mr. Bolton sends a letter to Merle at the orphanage that John Rudolph left in the middle of the night, 3.5 months before his time was up with the Boltons. Merle replies back to let them know if they find him. On April 12, 1925, in a letter to Merle from Bolton, he states that he has no idea where John Rudolph went or why he left. He never mentioned going anywhere he could find him. In the past, John had worked for a neighbor, Joe Zolmer, for $70 or $80, but the neighbor had nothing to do with him leaving. Mr. Bolton said John was a good boy, and if he was to return, he might not be satisfied in such short of a time, so they did not want to try very hard to find him. On May 30th, 1925, a letter is sent to Bolton telling him that his time expires with John in July, and he needs to send him the $75 to the orphanage to forward to John, as well as 2 good suits of clothes. In July, Bolton sends the money to the school and acknowledges the receipt and inquires whether or not he knows John's whereabouts. Response is that they do not know where he is. In August of 1925, Bolton sends another letter asking if they found John and if he received the money. Response was that they did not know his whereabouts, but will keep the money for him until he appears. A year later, November 1st, 1926, John sends a letter to the Owatonna orphanage stating that he is home now in Sawyer and wants his money as, quote, I need some winter clothes and there is no work up here yet. On November 4th, Superintendent Merrill sends the money to John and he receives it. At that point, John is no longer indentured out by the orphanage. The Charles Harp family of Stillwater applied to the orphanage for a boy and a girl. At first they were offered George and Violet Johnson. However, after several letters, it was determined that they would get Arnold and Sylvia instead. On August 13, 1917, Arnold and Sylvia were indentured to the Harps. On a state agent report in 1920 in which Arnold was 10 years old, it was stated that Mrs. Harp seemed to think that a boy of Arnie's age should be able to do more than he is doing. She does not seem to realize that a boy his age needs time to play. She complained, unless he is being watched, he'd forget his work and play with the dog. He was just returning from school when I reached the house, and without waiting to be told, went to his room and changed his clothes ready to do chores. They evidently took the children for the help that they could be for them on the farm. They formerly lived in St. Paul and moved on the farm for the benefit of the boy, but found that he would not stay on the farm, but has gone into town for work. On that same visit, the state agent reported on Sylvia. Sylvia, as well as Arnie, will earn all that they get in this house. They will perhaps not be overworked, but will no doubt be busy, as Mr. and Mrs. Harp are hard workers. In the state agent's report in 1922, when Arnold was 12, it was remarked that Arnie was fixing the tires on their auto, in which he is very much interested. In 1923, Mrs. Harp writes letters to the orphanage complaining about the children. She states that they don't mind, that Arnold does not help even though he is 6 feet tall and 180 pounds, and they couldn't feed him for nothing. That she can't afford to hire a man to help at the farm because she is supporting Arnold and Sylvia. They do what they want and not as they are told. She asked for Merle's help and said that they were willing to keep the children if they would mind. Merrill sends a letter to Arnold and Sylvia telling them how good the Harps had been to them and how bad they were acting towards them. If they didn't improve, other arrangements would have to be made. Mrs. Harp writes another letter to Merrill that the children continue to be mean and sassy, that Arnold won't get up in the morning to work, that she'd give anyone $5 to come see how the children act. She requests that Agent Jaeger visits them and has a talk with them. Mrs. Harp also sends a letter to Agent Jaeger requesting that he come at once, as they can no longer stand the behavior of Arnold and Sylvia. Merle also sends a letter to Jaeger telling him to visit the Harps. On June 25, 1925, the agent visits the Harps. At this point, Sylvia is 15 and a half and Arnold is 16 years old. He writes, "These children have gone beyond the control of Mr. and Mrs. Harp. They have reached the age when they want to go to dances and parties, or to the neighbors on evenings and Sundays as they please. One of the neighbors are unfriendly to the Harp family and set Arnie up against them, and to think their house Arnie goes more often than anywhere else. He is abusive, Mrs. Harp, and ignores his directions entirely, and Sylvia does the same to Mrs. Harp. The children have had a good home here, and have been treated as one of their own children, and until recently have been getting along well, with the exception of occasional outbursts of temper when reproved. I had a good talk with them, trying to show them the errors of their conduct, but I doubt they will do very much better, as they are very headstrong, and outside influences will keep them stirred up, and the Harps will never allow them to go as they please to dances and parties. I fear that we'll have to remove them sooner or later." On September 25, 1925, Merrill sends a letter to the Harps in which he advises returning the children and paying the prorated fees of $58.58 for Arnold and $51.25 for Sylvia. The next document in the file was a state agent's report on Sylvia at age 16. The state agent report from April 7th, 8th, and 9th of 1926 regarding Sylvia Raiha, age 16. Recommendations and remarks. I examined the register at the Nicollet Hotel and found that on January 17, 1926, there was registered a W. W. Gregory and wife of St. Paul. They registered long after midnight while the night clerk, Mr. Bedford, was on duty. No report of the affair was reported to the manager of the hotel, but the manager called Mr. Bedford for me, asking him if he remembered the couple. He recalled the whole affair, and I went out to his apartment, number 301 Vine Hall, on 15th Street, and talked with him. He told practically the same story as was reported to us by Miss Nathaway. He said that Linda Barr came to the desk after the couple had been taken to their room and told the clerk that they were not man and wife. They went up to the room, and Gregory insisted that they were married, but they were ordered out. Both Gregory and Sylvia say that they went to the bus station in Minneapolis and waited there for the first bus to St. Cloud. They claimed that they registered at the Nicollet about 3 a.m. Gregory says they stopped there so he could change clothes and be ready for the hockey game which they were going to. Mr. Bedford, night clerk, says that neither of them were undressed when he went into the room. He said Gregory had his coat off and Sylvia had her coat off and hat, but that was all. Sylvia was sitting on the edge of the bed, and he thought Gregory had been sitting by her. There was a bottle on the dresser which Mr. Bedford thought was ginger ale. I visited the Harp home and had a long talk with Sylvia and also with Mrs. Harp. Sylvia is a very stubborn girl and not at all pleasant girl to talk to, as she will not talk nor even answer except to say yes or no occasionally. She seems to be infatuated with Gregory, and perhaps it is because he is the only one who has ever paid any attention to her. I don't think that Sylvia is a bad girl, but she could easily be influenced. She says that nothing happened while she was with Gregory. She says he had something to drink with him, and that they drank at the St. Paul when they were stopped for lunch. She claims that Lana Barr drank with Gregory, but they did not offer her any, and that Gregory did not drink while he was in the car with her. Mrs. Harp claims that Sylvia is always coaxing to go down to town to get her hair cut, and it is just for an excuse to see Gregory. Sylvia will not help do the work, but just sits there in her room all day long. She will wash dishes, and that is all. She is a big, strong girl, and could help a great deal, if only she would. I visited Gregory on the street in Lake Elmo. He is a little dark fellow and had been drinking as his eyes were bloodshot, and he looked rather tough. I asked him if he had any explanation of his conduct on the night he took Sylvia to Minneapolis and registered her as his wife, and he said he didn't know how old she was and that he had no wrong intentions. He admitted that it wasn't the proper thing to do, but that he had asked Sylvia some days before the event if she could go with him, and she called him the day of the dance and said that Mrs. Harp said that she could go. Now Mrs. Harp claims to have known nothing about it and worried all night and all Sunday when Sylvia did not return from the dance. Both Sylvia and Gregory say that she stayed at St. Cloud with all the other girls who accompanied the fellows to the game. They said it was not at a hotel, but thought it was a private home. But Gregory says he paid for a room for Sylvia so she could sleep while he played hockey. After the game, they went by bus to Fairfax, and he played there too, and then they returned to St. Paul by bus to Lake Elmo by taxi and stayed there at Gregory's boarding place for supper, and then he took the girl home, which was about 11 p.m. Sunday. I do not think that Sylvia is happy in her home, nor do I think that she is doing her part in the home there. Mrs. Harp does not want to put up with her any longer and would be very glad to have the girl leave. I think it would be best thing to take Sylvia away from the home and at the neighborhood before something does happen to her. I talked to her about coming back to the school for a while, but she gives one no satisfaction as to how she feels about such things, as she will not talk. If we could find out just where Gregory and Sylvia went while in St. Cloud and in Fairfax, we might have something against the fellow, but they both claim that nothing happened, and so far I have no proof otherwise. Gregory has just been arrested for driving while intoxicated and for drunkenness and has paid the fine. A clipping for the Stillwater paper is attached. I will inquire at St. Cloud and see if I can find where they registered there, but I think that Sylvia should be brought back to the school and given work, as she is not the kind of girl that would give satisfaction in any home until she gets to the place where she realizes that she must work and do something in payment for the home and clothes given her. After that incident, the child worker Nathaway recommended that Sylvia be removed from the Harps' home. On May 22, 1926, Liza Mackey applies for Sylvia, and Sylvia returns to Sawyer. Arnold remains with the Harps. The following year, in February, Arnold sends a letter to Merle telling him that a neighbor wanted to hire him, and he couldn't wait until his time was up in April at the Harps. So he was leaving to work for the neighbor, since he had no intention of staying with the Harps. Merle responds to Arnold that he should stay with the Harps until his time is up, so he gets his money for being there, and that the farmer that wants to hire him will probably be willing to wait until he is done with his contract with the Harps. On March 1st, 1927, a letter to the Harps telling him that Arnold is done and that they need to send $75 to the school for him. Harps then send the money back to Owatonna the next month. A few days later, Arnold sends a letter looking for his money that the Harps sent for him, as he had just bought a car and needed the money for the down payment. He knew that the Harps had sent the money on Saturday. The next day, Merle sends a letter to Arnold telling him not to buy the car, as it is the worst thing he could do. It would be a source of expense, and he would not be able to save any of his earnings. The expense of running a car and keeping it is too heavy for a boy like him who is working for wages, and two, it is likely to get him into trouble. Merle also sends a letter to Arnold telling him that the money received will be kept in the treasury until he turns 21, earning some interest. He told Arnold that he had indicated that a man in the neighborhood wanted to hire him, so he should be able to earn his way and deposit his money in a bank to get ahead. The $75 in the treasury is a good start for his savings account. The following year, Arnold sent another letter to Merle requesting the $75 again. He says he is out of work, has been trying to get work for 3 weeks, and has applied at a few places. The next month, Merle acknowledges the letter Harp sent to him about Arnold's conduct. Arnold was still living with them at the time, and so he stated that he is sorry that Arnold appears to be taking advantage of their home, even though he is no longer under their direct supervision. He tells him that Arnold had just sent him a letter requesting the $75. Therefore, he is enclosing the check and tells them to have Arnold sign it. Merle also sent a letter to Arnold, in which he states he is surprised that Arnold is living with the Harps again. Per his request, he is sending $75 and advises to pay Mr. Harp for the room and board, then to use the balance to good advantage. At this point, when he gets the money, he is actually 19 years old and so did not have to wait to age 21, as stated earlier. Merle also stated in the letter, "You cannot afford to spend your money foolishly, and if you're out of work, you should be very careful with what you have. I hope you'll be able to secure employment soon and that you'll have not to depend on Mr. Harp for anything." Arnold's response to Merle was, he received a letter yesterday and was going to find out about the check because he couldn't understand why he should sign it if he hadn't gotten the check. He states, "The Harps wanted me to pay room and board, and I told them I wouldn't give them any money before they gave me a different bed. I had to sleep on a cot instead of having a mattress like it was supposed to be. I had 2 old horse blankets to lay on. I wouldn't have said nothing if they wouldn't had nothing else, but there was a mattress lying there the whole time. She was afraid I would split the mattress if I laid on it. I told them I would give them the money if they'd give me better care and not kick me around like a dog like they did when I was smaller. I had to do a man's work, and now they can get a lot of money out of me besides, and if they get the money, I'm sure I will not see anything of it. Yours truly, Arnold Raiha." He finished the letter with the address of an auto dentist if they needed to respond to him. At that point, Arnold was given his money, and so his indentured agreement with the Harps was ended. Martha Elizabeth was eventually adopted by the Rife sisters after being taken out of the Owatonna State School. From the History of the Children report, placed November 18, 1914 with Miss Henrietta Rife, North St. Paul, Minnesota. Ramsey County accompanied by Miss Rife. After all arrangements had been made in place to Martha in Miss Rife's home, Miss Olson brought a letter from Judge F.A. Watkins recommending that the Raiha children be held for 6 months or longer to give the mother an opportunity to make it whole for them. Miss Rife was informed of this by the superintendent. She was willing to take Martha, however, on the condition that the mother becomes able to take her children, and wants Martha, she will return her. December 23, 1914, Merle sends a letter to Henrietta Rife. "Dear Madam, I am sending under separate cover a little box that Martha's mother sent her, and you can do as you think best about giving it to her. We wish you all Merry Christmas and hope the children are well and happy." From the history report, it is noted that March 21, 1915, the mother called at the school and took Sylvia. She was satisfied at this time to have Martha remain in her home. She was not given Martha's address, but may know. On March 19, 1915, a letter of introduction was written by Carleton County Judge to Merle and brought down to the Owatonna State School when Liza went there to try to get Martha back. "Dear Sir, this will introduce Mrs. Raiha of this county, who is making no small sacrifices to see her children. I am sorry not to have been able to give you more notice of her coming and have a reply from you. I trust, however, that anything that you can do to help her bring her baby back with her, you will do, as she has labored diligently to keep her little home bright and cheery, to retain her little herd of cows, and to win the confidence of her neighbors." March 22nd, the judge receives a reply from Merle. "Mrs. Raiha visited her children at the school Friday and Saturday of last week. We explained to her that the baby Martha has been placed in a good home, and she said that she is satisfied to let her remain there. She took the little girl Sylvia home with her. I think she is satisfied with the arrangement." It is then noted on the report on June 16, 1915, that Ms. Barkhofer made an excellent report, that the family are very much attached to Finny. From that report, its moral condition. Answer: good, lovable baby. The family are greatly attached to her, although at first they were not impressed. Remarks: Miss Rife and her father were greatly when they found out that I had not come to take Finny, as they all name her. I told that the mother had taken another child when she found out that Martha was in a good home. From that report, it said that on June 1st, 1916, Miss Rife asked for permission to adopt. Permission is sent. On September 28, 1916, Miss Barkhofer makes an excellent report. From that report, child's physical condition, excellent. She has very white hair, but a nice-looking baby. Its moral condition is stubborn. On December 14, 1916, a certified copy of the decree of adoption is received. Martha is now Martha Elizabeth Rife. Martha ends up being one of 9 girls adopted by Minna Rife. She was maintained at the school about 1 month. On July 29, 1925, Liza sends a letter directly to Miss Minna Rife. Dear Madam, some time ago I noticed a picture of some children which you had adopted in a St. Paul newspaper. One of these was a daughter of mine, namely Martha Elizabeth, Finnish, age 12 years. I wonder if you have a picture of her available, as I haven't any of her at all, and I would appreciate your kindness very much in giving me one. Thanking you in advance for this little favor, yours truly, Liza Jeremiasson. On November 10th, a few months later, Miss Rife writes a letter to Mr. Merle at the Owatonna State School and his advice as far as what to do about the request. Dear Mr. Merle, enclosed I am sending you a letter and am asking you for your advice in regards to it. We received it some time ago and have been troubled ever since learning what to do about it. The request in itself is a small matter, but it is consequences which we fear. We have had so much trouble with the mother of the Moore sisters because she knew where her children were, and so we dread a possible repetition in Martha's case. Martha Raiha is happy with us, and we are very fond of her. It would make hardship on her and us if complications should arise through her mother. She is an exceptionally bright child and is the kind worth sending on to college. I hope you will let us know what we ought to do, what would be the right thing to do under the circumstances. Perhaps it will interest you to know that Maria Moore turned out splendid. She graduated from Minnesota 3 years ago and since then has been with the Southeast Division of the Red Cross as a visitation specialist. Very sincerely yours, Henrietta Rife. November 13th, Merle sends a response. In answer to your letter, it is hard to know what to do regarding Mrs. Raiha's request for a picture of Martha. If it is not given, she will continue to request it. On the other hand, if it is given, she may be satisfied and make no further trouble. I am inclined to think it'd be well to send a photograph on a plain card with no address. If you prefer, you may send it here, and we will send it to Mrs. Raiha with the request that all communications regarding the child be sent to this office. I am delighted to know that Martha is such a bright child and doing so well, and also that Maria Moore has developed so splendidly. Maria sent us a photograph of herself after graduation from the university. She certainly is a fine girl. With kind personal regards to yourself and sister, and best wishes for your continued success in rearing of your family of girls, I am yours truly, Galen Merle. On May 31st, 1931, Miss Rife reports that Martha is graduating from high school this spring with a fine record. The letter is kept in file 4128. This is the end of Martha's file with the Owatonna State School. As the children were growing up in their respective homes, Liza continued to live on the farm in Sawyer. On April 14, 1917, the Owatonna Orphanage sent the letter to Liza with a picture of the children. Simon has already left to be with Eileen, so in the picture is John, Arnold, Sylvia, and Jonas. All were doing well and going to school. On April 22nd, Liza responded to the school. Please accept my thanks for the picture you sent me of my children. I wondered if you could do me a favor by sending, if you have, a picture of my little daughter, Martha Elizabeth. I would like to have an enlarged picture of them all. If you would do this, I would be very much obliged to you. Hoping to hear from you in regards to the picture, I am truly yours, Mrs. L. Samola. On April 24th, the school responded that they had no photo of Martha, but they would send one if they received one later. The last report indicates she is good health, happy, and developing well. On December 4th, 1917, Liza sent another letter to the school. Dear Sirs, sometime I sent a box of candy and $1 and also wrote a letter to John Raiha. Having received no answer whether they received the above-mentioned things or not, I am taking the liberty of writing to you to find out if they're still at the school. I would like to send them a few Christmas presents. Thanking you for an early reply, yours very truly, Mrs. L. Samola. The reply back from the school was that John, Arnie, Sylvia, and Jonas are not at the school. They have been placed in good family homes as the law governing the school directs. The box of candy and the $1 sent in June were given to the children. A notable event of this time was the Cloquet Fire in 1918. It did not reach Sawyer because of Big Lake. It ended up going around Sawyer. Vaino then died in September 1919, possibly from kidney failure. He is buried close to Jonas in an unmarked grave in Sawyer. Vienna, as she grew older, attended the Sawyer School that was built in 1922 after the Normantown Day School was closed by the state. A few months after Vano died, Liza married William Mackey in December 1919 so as not to lose Vienna to the orphanage. A few years later, on March 21, 1923, Liza again writes to the school. Dear Sir, I am writing in regards to my children that were at your school in the year 1917. I visited at that time, and 4 of them were still there, and so I'd like to know if they've been adopted, and if so, what kind of home they are in. In one of the recent newspapers, I saw the youngest child, Martha, her picture, and also the picture of her guardians. I would be very grateful to you if you'd give me some information, as that will relieve my thoughts of them considerably. Thanking you, I am respectively Mrs. Liza Raiha Mackey. The response back from the school was that they're all provided with good homes, nicely situated, doing well with good people that give them excellent care. 2 years later, on September 29, 1925, John Arvid Raiha sends a letter to the school. Dear Sir, will you please let me know if any of the Raiha children are there? John, Arnie, Sylvia, Willie, or Martha. If they are not there, will you please let me know where they are? Yours truly there, Brother John Raiha, 310 East 1st Street, Duluth, Minnesota. October 3, 1925, the response to John Arvid. The children are not there, all have been placed in homes, and they cannot give them the addresses. This letter would lead to the confusion between the two Johns by the Owatonna Orphanage. On November 4, 1925, Liza hired attorney Victor Gahn, who sent a letter to the school requesting to know the whereabouts of the children, as Liza had written several times but has never received a satisfactory answer. The school responded back to the attorney. They can give the condition of the children, but not addresses unless the foster parents are willing. The school then gave the address of John Rudolph since he was 18. However, the address given was that of John Arvid. Letter further reported that Arnie and Sylvia are in the same home and in good health. Jonas was in good health, contented and happy and well liked by his foster parents. Martha was legally adopted, which makes her her own child of the foster parents. The supervision and control of the state ceases when legal adoption takes place. On November 13, 1925, Liza followed this up with another letter to the school. Dear Sir, in answer to your letter with information to Victor Gah of Duluth, I will say there is an error in the part of the address of John, as he does not live at the address given to you as 310 East 1st Street, Duluth. There are 2 boys that have the same name. John in the family, the oldest, 27 years old, has never been in your institution, and his full name is John Arvid, and he resides at 310 East 1st Street, Duluth, and he has also written to you in regards to his brother John Rudolph. Please locate John Rudolph for me, as he is at liberty to take care of himself. I would like to get in touch with them. I would like to know the address where he was first taken from your school, or any other address where you have visited him since he was taken from your school. I have known about Martha's home ever since she had been adopted by it, but I had never inquired further, as I am satisfied she is in a good home. But I would be very glad to know where Arnie, Sylvia, and Jonas are, and if you would let me know where they are now. I assure you I will not disturb them in any way, or their foster parents either. The reason I want to know is because the children are consistently on my mind, and if I only knew where they were, it would relieve my mind considerably. I would ask you to write on my behalf to the respective foster parents, and perhaps they would be willing to let me know. Thanking for this favor, I am very truly yours, Mrs. Elizabeth Raiha, Mrs. William Mackey. On November 16th, the school responded to Liza. They noted that they were mistaken in the address of John. John Rudolph's last address was Fairfax, Minnesota. They would also ask the other foster parents whether or not they are willing to let her communicate with their children. Liza then writes a letter to the chief of police in Fairfax. Will you please let me know if my son has been working for Mr. Bolton for wages? And will you please try to locate my son, or tell me where I can locate him? Thank you for your kindness in this matter. Yours truly, Mrs. William Mackey of Sawyer, Minnesota. On November 13, 1925, she got a response. Dear Madam, am sending you the information of Mr. Bolton. Mr. J. Bolton is living in this town and is farming. I asked Mr. Bolton about his son, and he said he left his place 3 months before his time was due working and don't know where he went to. So I think it'd be best for you to inquire about him at the state school. Yours truly, Chief of Police, Joseph J. December 1st, Liza writes to the orphanage. She reported that she sent a letter to Mr. Bolton and it was returned unopened. She then wrote a letter to the Chief of Police and enclosed it. The school's response to Liisa was that the school had not heard from him. They did receive $75 from Bolton and will send it to him once they know where he is. The school thought he was John in Duluth until Liisa informed him differently. December 17, 1925, the school sends John Arvid $75 since they thought he was John Rudolph. Letter was returned with the money not claimed. On May 22, 1927, the state agent made a report in order to determine whether or not Sylvia could return home. In the report, they stated that there is one 10-year-old Vienna as the only child in the home. In the remarks, he had called the probate court, and the judge advised consultation with Mrs. Oscar Isaacson on who the court, county nurse, etc. depend on for information and assistance. She has known the family for 20 years, helped with the babies, and accompanied the children when committed to the state school. She strongly advises the return to Sylvia. She said that Mrs. Mackey has given up the children willingly, largely because of financial reasons and the prospect of getting a second husband who did not want them. He, Samola, died after a few years, leaving her with one child, Vienna. 6 years ago, she married William Mackey and is expecting the first child next fall. She has worked hard and now owns the place clear of debt which Mr. Raiha had left heavily mortgaged as well as all the stock. 2 years ago, the house burned with all its contents. They got $800 of insurance and built a neat 3-room cottage. They have engaged a carpenter to come as soon as possible to add 2 rooms upstairs and enlarge the downstairs. They also expect to build a new barn later. They have about 6 milking cows. They make and sell butter. Mrs. Mackey sews quite well, makes the clothes, and does nice fancy work. The house is well kept and attractive. Mrs. Isaacson said that Mrs. Mackey has, the past year, become much more concerned over the welfare of her children, become more interested in religion, etc. When she learned John Rudolph had left his home, she was nearly frantic, and about 6 weeks ago had a radio message broadcasted for him. He was located and has just left after a 2-week visit home. They said he is a fine boy, works on a milk route for $50 a month and board for F.H. Schroeder, Route 5, Montevideo, Minnesota. I saw a letter he had just written to Vienna, which he said he liked his work, but it was not like being at home. When I called, she was afraid there was some punishment coming for him for running away. I was told Mr. Mackey used to drink, but has not for some years. Both will be very glad to have Sylvia, and I see no reason why they could not make her a good home. I did not tell him about her recent behavior, just that she was not getting on well with the people and did not wish to keep her. May 27, 1927. Harp sends a letter to Nathaway telling her to come and see Sylvia because they cannot do anything more with her. Harp also sends a letter to Merrill telling him how good Sylvia has it there, and she gave her some silk stockings for her birthday, but she still does not mind them. June 2, 1927. Mariel sends a letter to Harp saying that the agent will come there to take Sylvia from them. 2 days later, Merrill sends another letter saying Sylvia will be picked up on June 7th and that the Harps will owe $31.74 for her to be paid to the agent at the pickup. After Sylvia leaves, the Harps send a letter to Merrill asking if Sylvia got there all right and how lonesome they are for her. She was awfully stubborn and sassy, but still, if you got children for so long, they seem just like your own. Mrs. Harp then asks for her address as she wants to send her some things and says again how she had a good home there, but she just didn't realize it. The Harps send another letter to Merrill asking for another girl, but not no Finlanders. Any other nice loving girl and nice looking. The June 9th response from Merrill to Harps. He wants to wait to give her the address until after the agent returns. Also, quote, I wish to consult our agent before I tell whether we would advise you to take another girl. You have had occasion to complain so much about Sylvia that we hesitate to have you try another girl. June 14, 1926, a Mrs. Henry Wetzel writes a letter to Merrill telling him that she heard that Sylvia was taken away by an agent. She wanted to know where she was going to, the address, as she was very much interested in her. Merrill responds back that Sylvia is in a private residence and he is not at liberty to give her address, and correspondence with her might disturb her and become discontented where she is. From Mullen's report from the removal of Sylvia. She told Mrs. Harp to meet her in Lake Almo. When she got to Lake Almo, they were not there, so she phoned Mrs. Harp. Mrs. Harp said that they had not left yet. Then they arrived an hour later. Then Sylvia wanted to get her hair cut, and Arnold refused to drive them as he did not want Sylvia to leave. He finally brought her bag and her to a garage several blocks away. By this time, they were delayed 2 hours. Since the drive to Sawyer was nearly 300 miles, she drove faster than she had planned. On the detour of number 1, about 5 miles south of Cromwell, I turned out the center of the road to avoid some bumps, and the right wheels went into the grass at the side of the road. The ground was marshy, so the car would not turn back onto the road, and we came to a stop at a slight tilt. The small boy in the front seat did not strike the dash, and Sylvia said she was not hurt at all, but she probably struck her arm against the handle controlling the window. It was raining, so she sent the children to a nearby farmhouse for supper until the car could be pulled back onto the road. She left Sylvia with Mrs. Isaacson since the wet conditions made it impossible to get to the Mackeys since their road is impassable. The insurance company said they would pay for it. June 13th, a letter to McMullen at the state school from Mrs. Isaacson. Sylvia seems to be sick, has headaches and vomits. Mrs. Mackey also wants to know if she has to pay for the doctor's expenses, as she feels she isn't responsible for Sylvia's injuries. Sylvia is very lonesome for Arnie. If you're going to take Arnie out of the Harp home, they want to have Arnie there, as now they have the means to take care of him. We would like you to come here and see Sylvia and possibly bring Arnie with you. The June 23rd letter from the state agent to Mrs. Isaacson. Sorry to hear Sylvia is not feeling well, but cannot be due entirely to the bump in the car. We'll be in your neighborhood next week and we'll see both of you. June 30th, 1926, the state agent report. The state agent went to Mrs. Isaacson first. Mrs. Isaacson was suspicious that Sylvia was pregnant. They all went to their house, and Sylvia said she is feeling quite well, but her arm and shoulder are somewhat stiff. She was lonesome for a while, especially as she could not understand Finnish, which most of the people speak. She says she likes it at home and appeared happy. She has written to Arnie so the Harps know where she is. The family is anxious for Arnie to be allowed to come home, if only for a visit. They may arrange this by correspondence with the Harps, but it would seem better for him to remain there till he is 18. Sylvia said there is nothing wrong, but Mrs. Isaacson is still doubtful. She called Dr. Franklin Ryder, the physician in Cloquet who examined her once. He took x-rays of her arm and shoulder but found nothing broken. There is also a slight misplacement of the bone in the shoulder, but he thought this would not last long. No mention of sick headaches and vomiting, so yet no other opinion as to her health otherwise. On July 8th, Liza sends a letter to McMullen at the state school requesting money for Sylvia's injuries from the accident. The doctor's bill is $6 and 3 weeks of illness at $10 a week, totaling $36. State said her arm is better and she can move it. Also, John Rudolph has not received his money yet, and could you send it to Sawyer, as he will be moving back any day now. July 12th, Merrill responds. McMullen is on vacation until August. He did not understand the validity of her claim. If the doctor has a claim of $6, he did not understand the claim of $10 a week for 3 weeks. Quote, "This is your daughter who is returned to you at your request, and if this is a claim against the state, I may only say that there has been no money appropriated by the legislature to pay such a claim." Unquote. July 17th, Liza responds to Merrill. The injury was caused by the car going in the ditch. The doctor said no bones were broken, but she could not use her arm for 3 weeks. Mrs. McMullen said she was insured and the insurance company would pay. August 16, 1926, Isaacson sends a letter to McMullen at the state school. Sylvia has been with us for a week now, as there was some sort of misunderstanding at her home with her stepfather. Her mother had her pack up and go, and she did. It was late in the evening, so she walked to the closest neighbors. I went in the morning and found her and brought her home, thinking her folks would change their mind about her in a day or two. They did not want her to go back, and I am at a loss of what to do with her. She acts really nice and quiet and is contented to stay with us, but I feel we cannot afford to keep her for any length of time. As I understand it, Sylvia is not at fault, and I think she's a nice girl, so awaiting a reply from you. State Agent Report of September 14, 1926. Sylvia Raiha was born in Carleton County, 1910. Her father died when she was about 9 years old, and because the mother had a very large family and could not support all of them, Sylvia was sent to Owatonna. She reported that she had been placed in the home of Charles Harp, Lake Elmo, Minnesota, and had remained there until June of 1926. She had finished 8th grade in the Lake Elmo school. The girl had been given a 30-day sentence at the industrial home for drunkenness. When she was asked why she had been sent to the industrial home, she said that she had been caught with Oscar Dahlberg. The child evidently thought that that was the reason for her arrest. According to her story, her mother had turned her out of the house because her stepfather was constantly complaining about her not working. When riding with Mrs. McMullen of the state public schools, she had been in a slight automobile accident, and her arm had been injured so that she had not been able to work. After she had been turned away from home, she had gone to Superior, and a man, Mike, whose last name she did not know, had paid for her room at the Grand Hotel. She insisted that she had at no time been intimate with Mike, but while she was staying at the hotel, she had gone out with at least 3 different men and had relations with every one. They had given her money, but could not remember just how much each had given her, and she had no idea who the men were. While in Superior, she had met Oscar Dahlberg, and he persuaded her to go to Gary to keep house for Mr. Yeager, where he roomed. There is one other man living at the place besides Mr. Yeager and Mr. Dahlberg. Sylvia stayed in the Yeager home from Friday into Tuesday, and while there slept with Mr. Dahlberg. On Tuesday, she was arrested and sent to the industrial home. Dr. Hatch thought that in all probability the girl was pregnant. She also had a positive GC. When the reason for Sylvia's having left the Harp home was discussed, she said that she had gone to St. Paul after a dance with the William Gregory and had stayed over Sunday with the man. September 15th. Mrs. Mackey, Sylvia's mother, and Mrs. Isaacson, a neighbor, came into the office. Mrs. Mackey was an ignorant Finnish woman and spoke little English, although she seemed to understand most of what was said. Mrs. Isaacson was a neighbor who lived on the adjacent farm and was very much interested in Sylvia. She said that Mr. Mackey had objected to Sylvia's being around, and as he felt that she was not doing enough work. Mrs. Isaacson felt that the work was too hard for Sylvia, that she had been working in a place with moderate conveniences, and that the work at home was difficult for her. When Mrs. Mackey had told her that Sylvia must leave home, she had said she would keep her in her home until word could be received from Owatonna. Sylvia stayed with her a week and was evidently very happy. One night, after the family had gone to bed, Sylvia disappeared. The next morning, when she called her, she had no response, and when she went upstairs, she found the bed empty. They had no further word from her until they heard of her arrest. When the women were told about Sylvia's actions since that time, they were both quite overcome, and Mrs. Mackey said she could not take Sylvia home under any circumstances. She was expecting to be confined very shortly, and was in no condition to supervise the girl, although she had promised Miss McMullen that she would do the best she could after she had been told of Sylvia's affair with Mr. Gregory. On September 23rd, Merle sends a letter to McMullen. Better to attend to the Sylvia Raiha case before going to Itasca. Quote, "It is a sad development in her case that you describe." Unquote. She could have the case heard in Carleton County or in St. Louis County, where the offense appears to be committed. McMullen's response. Sylvia was sentenced to 30 days to the industrial home in Duluth, but Miss Strand thinks that she should go to Sauk Center. As she was living with her mother in Carleton County, I think she should be committed from there rather than St. Louis County. On October 2nd, Sylvia is discharged from the state public school. On October 24th, McMullen sends a letter to Merle. Miss Strand told her that Sylvia Raiha has been found and was sent to Sauk Center last week. On November 4th, 1927, Merle sends a check for $32.84 to Mary Stewart, the superintendent for the State Home for Girls and Sauk Center, to give to Sylvia. At this point, Sylvia is no longer indentured by the Owatonna Orphanage. On November 29, 1926, Tiny was born. On April 30th, 1929, Amelia was born. Also in 1929, Martha, who is now age 16, went back home to Sawyer to visit Liza, who is now 42, and Vienna 13 on the farm. In the 1930s, Amelia and Tiny would visit Eileen, John, and Sima while they were growing up. In 1939, Amelia even spent a few weeks with Simon and her husband Frank in the summer. I would believe that Jonas was also located sometime in the 1930s, so at that time, Liza knew the location of all the children that had went to Owatonna. Over the years, however, William continued to drink and spent a lot of his money on alcohol, so Liza finally told him to leave and divorced him. He moved to Duluth, and Liza continued to do all the field work, including the plow and the horse and butchering, but she was probably already doing that anyways. In 1935, she divorced William. Liza then raised Tiny, Amelia, and Vienna herself with a lot of help from John Rudolph. John Rudolph would take the girls to movies in town. He worked as a mechanic and would bring home girlfriends for them to meet. He met his future wife, K.D., while stationed at Fort Leonard Wood. They married and wanted to have children, but could not. Amelia and Tiny would pick blueberries at Wild Rice Lake and also south of the farm by the river. Liza would can blueberry sauce, but the girls would sell what they picked at the Fred Larson store for 7 cents a quart, and they would make about 35 to 42 cents a day. They would buy 5-cent ice cream cones, then save the rest for the county fair in Barnum. They were members of the Sawyer 4-H Club, and they would stay at the fair for 3 days and 2 nights. Liza would sell house dresses for the women in Sawyer for some extra money. She also made the clothes for Amelia and Tiny until they were in the 7th grade. She didn't need a pattern for sewing, crocheting, or quilting. She would look at something and copy it. Liza lived on the farm for over 40 years with no running water, electricity, car, or a plowed road. The girls would get excused from elementary school in the winter to be in the woods cutting down trees for firewood to keep the house warm. One winter they were low on fuel, and Lisa got the county to plow a road so the truck could deliver 1 ton of coal, all that she could afford. They had 2 milking cows and some pigs that Lisa would butcher and chickens for eggs. During the Winter War between Russia and Finland in 1939 to 1940, Liza sent her family in Finland coffee, sugar, and other goods. Vienna suffered from tuberculosis the last 9 years that she was alive. She died at the age of 26 after spending her last years at the Aguachin Sanitarium in Walker, Minnesota, which was 120 miles from Sawyer. Aguachin means out of doors in Ojibwe. Tiny and Amelia would write letters to her once a week while she lived there. She was described as a selfless person that never complained about her condition. She had beautiful handiwork and liked to crochet, knit, and sew like her mother. One summer she came home for 2 weeks, but then got a bad cold, and everything went downhill after that. The day she died, Fred Larson had gotten a call from the Aguachin Sanitarium at the Sawyer store. Then he drove over in his truck to tell Liza and the girls as they were just getting ready to leave to visit her. Rudolph Belt, who is Eileen's son, owned the Northland Mortuary at the time, so he drove Liza and his hearse over to give Vienna's body. The nurses let Liza bathe and dress Vienna before bringing her back to Sawyer for the funeral. She died in 1942. When Amelia and Tiny started high school in Cloquet, they each moved into someone's home and worked for their keep, doing housework and taking care of the kids. Amelia worked in a doctor's house. In 1945, Liza finally sold the farm in Sawyer for $1,000 to Henry Sukla. Henry Sukla also was the person that witnessed her citizenship. Tiny said that she saw William a couple times around Duluth. Amelia said that he came to see her once at a dime store when she was working, and he gave her $1. In the late 1940s, it is believed that William Mackey died in a Bowery fire in Duluth. In 1946, John Arvid died, leaving 4 sons behind. In 1945 to 1946, Liza spent some time out in Portland, Oregon, where she stayed with her brother John and spent a few months with them and worked in a hospital there. Back home in Minnesota, she also stayed close to her other siblings, her brother Jocko Matson, who lived in the Cloquet area, and her brother Isaac, who lived in Esco, and she visited him a lot. Isaac was a good carpenter, and he built the house that Tiny and her husband Clayton moved to on the Arrowhead Road in Duluth. She also continued to have a close relationship with her sister Anna over the years. In 1961, Liza made a trip to Finland to visit many family and friends. In 1964, little Jonas died, leaving behind 2 sons. In 1970, Liza died. Liza was then buried at the Sawyer Cemetery. She was to be buried next to Vienna. However, there was a miscommunication with Bill Jascari, who hired 2 Native Americans to dig the grave. Instead of being buried next to Vienna, she was buried at an angle from Vienna. In 1971, both Arnold and Eiley died. Arnold left behind 2 sons and a daughter, and Eiley left behind 1 son and 1 daughter. In 1972, John Ruliff died along with his wife Katie in a traffic crash on a bridge in Missouri. In 1978, Sima passed away in Duluth. She left behind no children. In 1984, Martha passed on, leaving 1 daughter, my mother Joan, and a son, Fisk. In 1994, Sylvia died, leaving behind 2 sons. And in 2014, Amelia died. Tiny, one of Liza's last children, is still alive at age 90 and lives in Tucson, Arizona. This video was recorded in January of 2017. The information contained in it came from a variety of sources: written reports, oral histories, and documentations from the Minnesota State Historical Society. Hopefully one now has a greater understanding of our Finnish ancestors and what they went through when they first came to America. Thank you.
lilli, minun äitini kultainen. Millaisen kivi vielpä lilli, poikani hiilainen. Sillä käyhen uppova, minun äitini kultainen. Millaisen höyhen uppova, poikani hiilainen. Sillaka kaikki tuomiolle tullaan. Westman Viiki tietää ratsasti, jolla hän nuorukaisen kohtasi. Kuulepas sä nuorukainen, mitä sanon sul? Taidatko sä vastata nää kysymykset mul? En ole oppinut vastailemaan. Eilen tapoin tämän maan sen Viikin kuninkaan. Tapoitko sä tämän maan sen Viikin kuninkaan? Silloin sinä tapoit minun veljen. Westman Viiki löi hänet